Chapter 1. A Silhouette in the Mist. That morning began like any other winter morning in this small forest-side town, so still that you could hear the faint flutter of a tiny bird's wings between the bare branches. Thick fog rolled down from the mountain slope, curling around the low rooftops, making the entire main street look like an abandoned hallway. The dark stone pavement was damp, mottled with thin, slick patches of ice that made the rare early footsteps cautious and slow. No one imagined that only a few minutes later, that stillness would be ripped apart. From the far end of the street, where the fog was so dense it blurred even shapes, a shadow began to emerge, moving slowly, almost deliberately. At first, it was nothing more than a vague blur, like the swaying silhouette of a tree in the wind. But as it drew closer, details began to form: a graceful, low, and powerful gait, pointed ears standing erect, trembling slightly in the breeze, and a pair of golden eyes, glowing like twin embers piercing through the gray mist. It was a bobcat, the North American wildcat, but not like the ones you see in glossy calendars or nature books. Its brownish-gray, striped fur was coated with a thin layer of mist, speckled with tiny frost crystals clinging to the edges of its whiskers. Each step landed with a dry, sharp click, the sound of claws meeting cold stone. The noise echoed strangely, as if the empty street itself had become a hollow drum, amplifying every movement. But it was not the eyes or the way it walked that froze people in place. Behind the bobcat, dragging along the ground, was a large, old blanket, frayed at the edges, blotched with dark stains of dried blood. The fabric rasped softly under its claws, the dragging sound falling in broken rhythms, blending with the faint hiss of wind slipping between the narrow gaps of the old buildings. A metallic, damp, and cold scent lingered in the air, something that had no place in a peaceful morning. The fog made everything seem to shift closer, then drift farther away, as if the bobcat were stepping out from another world. The few people present on the street, no more than 3, all stopped without realizing it. A woman clutched her scarf tighter around her neck, her eyes locked on the figure. An old man shoveling snow in front of the general store slowly set his shovel down. Tilting his head, no one spoke, no one dared to approach. There was only the sound of fabric scraping the ground and claws tapping on stone. Step by step, drawing nearer, when only a few yards, about 2 to 3 meters, separated it from them. The bobcat stopped, the wind shifted, pushing the mist aside to reveal everything. The blood had dried, but the stains were still deep and dark, as though they had soaked into the fibers. One corner of the blanket was rolled up, giving the unsettling impression that something had once been wrapped inside. The bobcat lifted its head, and its gaze did not sweep over the onlookers the way wild animals often do. It stared straight and unblinking, as if examining them. It was not the look of a hunter searching for prey, nor entirely one of wariness. There was something else, something both alien and urgent. For a few seconds, that was all there was: the gaze, the blanket, and the mist surrounding them. Then the wind shifted again, flipping up one edge of the blanket to reveal a faded embroidery, the figure of a teddy bear. Its once light brown threads now dulled beneath dirt and blood. The stitching had frayed at the edges, as if it had once been clutched tightly in someone's hands. That sight, even without full understanding, sent a chill crawling up the spine. The fog thickened again, swallowing the bobcat's hindquarters. It stood there, unmoving, neither advancing nor retreating. The wind rose, curling around the corners of the street, carrying with it the faint creak of an iron hinge somewhere out of sight. People began to feel an invisible pressure settle over them, an unnatural silence, like the pause between 2 heartbeats when waiting for something to happen. And then, as if cutting through that silence, a question began to take shape in every mind. What is it carrying, and why is it staring at us like that? Chapter 2. An uninvited piece of evidence. Inside the North Bend Diner, the winter morning unfolded as it always did. Steam fogged the windows. Spoons clinked against cups, and the aroma of coffee mingled with the scent of warm buttered pastries. From an old radio in the corner, a scratchy country song threaded its way through the sound of the wind. But then, from out on the street, a shadow began to take shape in the mist, swallowing up unfinished conversations. The small bell above the door gave a dry chime. Ethan Miller, 38 years old, a mechanic, stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hands marked with calluses from engine oil. His morning ritual was always the same, a black coffee before heading back to the shop, but this time, it was something else that drew him outside, a strange feeling. A blanket of unnatural silence hanging over the street. Cold fog wrapped around his torso. Then he heard it, the sharp click of claws striking the stone pavement. Mingled with the heavy scrape of fabric being dragged, the Bobcat emerged slowly, its head lowered, its jaws gripping the edge of a large, frayed blanket blotched with dried blood that had turned a deep, dark brown. A sudden gust flipped one corner of the blanket, revealing the clumsy embroidery of a teddy bear. Its stitches faded to pale silver. Around it were a few smudged letters, a long L, a low dotted I, and perhaps a crooked A. Ethan frowned. The cold, metallic tang in the wind made him stop in his tracks. Inside the diner, a few people pressed their faces to the glass, whispering, probably just dragging a scrap from the junkyard. But when Ethan stepped down from the porch, his eyes met the Bobcat's, not the look of a predator, nor that of a cornered animal, but something else, waiting. He crouched slightly, keeping his distance. At the edge of the blanket, threads had unraveled, and a single fine hair was caught in them. The smell of old blood clung to every fiber. All of it combined into a clear realization. This was no coincidence. The Bobcat nudged the blanket toward him, then stepped back half a pace, its gaze unwavering. It stood there, motionless, as if weighing the human's reaction. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the roof eaves and the faint creak of a wooden door hinge somewhere unseen. Sheriff Hank appeared, his boots crunching on shards of ice. He stopped a few yards away, about 2 to 3 meters behind Ethan, his expression shifting slightly as the metallic scent reached him. He did not need to explain. Anyone who had been near a wound would recognize it instantly. Could be from an animal, Hank said quietly, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Ethan did not answer. He simply pointed toward the edge of the street. Mixed in with the muddy streak trailing from the blanket were tiny footprints, not animal tracks, leading north, toward where the street vanished into the mist and met the edge of the forest. The Bobcat glanced in that direction, then looked back at Ethan, as if confirming that he had seen. And in that moment, Ethan understood. This animal had not come here by chance. It had brought evidence, and somehow, it had chosen him to witness it. Chapter 3. The Return Visits. That morning, after the Bobcat disappeared into the mist, Ethan stood motionless for a long while before heading back to the shop. Sheriff Hank had taken the blanket, sealing it inside a large plastic bag as if it were evidence from a crime scene. But it still haunted Ethan, the faded teddy bear, the smudged letters, and the cold, stale scent of old blood. All day, he could not focus on his work. The clink of metal, the whir of a drill, the hammering of tools, they all became a background rhythm to the morning's images replaying in his mind. Customers brought in their cars, he worked, tightened bolts, but his thoughts kept drifting to the end of the street, where the muddy little footprints had led into the forest. Night fell faster than usual. Winters in North Bend were like that. Daylight snuffed out as if someone had flipped a switch. By the time Ethan locked the shop, Main Street was already steeped in the bluish gray of dusk. He meant to head straight home, but a movement at the far end of the street slowed his steps. There, in the middle of the intersection under the pale yellow street light, the Bobcat stood, no fog to obscure it this time. Its fur was soaked from melting snow, droplets clinging to its whiskers. The golden eyes still held that light, something neither of the night nor of the street lamp. And it was staring at Ethan. Again, he froze, feeling the rush of blood toward his heart. The Bobcat did not move, did not blink, like that morning, but heavier, denser somehow. A breeze hissed through, and in the silence, Ethan could almost hear its breathing. He began walking slowly toward the intersection, but when he was about 30 feet away, about 10 meters, the Bobcat turned and headed north. Its pace was unhurried but kept enough distance between them. Ethan was about to follow when a voice called from behind him. "Do not. Tonight is not the night to go into the woods." It was Hank, leaning against his pickup parked along the curb. His eyes followed the Bobcat, But there was no fear there, more a sense of calculation. "It will be back," Hank said, with a strange certainty. Ethan did not ask why. The next morning, the town was buzzing with whispers about the strange wildcat that keeps staring at Ethan Miller. People began avoiding his gaze when passing him. Some regular customers made excuses not to bring their cars in, saying maybe next week, even though their vehicles still rattled and knocked. Someone muttered, "He is cursed." Ethan did not care. The more people avoided him, the more silence he had to observe, and he began to notice, every time the Bobcat appeared, there was something new lying near where it stopped. The third time, it stood near the general store, and in front of it was a small, waterlogged child's shoe. The leather was cracked from the cold, the laces twisted into a knot, and the surface still clung to a smear of soft, fresh mud. The fourth time, it was a cloth doll, one eye torn open with a white thread dangling out. The fifth time, it was a crumpled scrap of paper with the word, "Help," scrawled in pencil. Each time, Hank appeared, collected the item in a plastic evidence bag, and took it back to the station, but he never told Ethan whether anything was found. The only answer he ever gave was, "It is under investigation." For Ethan, this was no coincidence. It felt like a sequence of signals, each one clearer, each one more urgent, and at the center of every signal was the Bobcat. One night, Ethan sat alone in the shop, the cold white light of the fluorescent tube spilling across a cluttered workbench of bolts and wrenches. He was not working, he just stared at the darkness beyond the window. And then, there it was, framed in the glass, those golden eyes. No sound, no warning, only that gaze, and a certainty in his chest. If he stood now, if he walked outside, the Bobcat would lead him somewhere. But Ethan stayed put, not out of fear, but because some part of him knew, once he followed, there would be no way back. From that night on, he began to dream of it. In his dreams, the Bobcat stood on a snow-covered road, the deep forest darkness looming behind it. Each time he tried to approach, it retreated until its shape melted into the night, leaving only footprints and a long drag mark across the snow. One day, Hank came to the shop. He leaned against the doorway, silent for a while before speaking. "I think it is trying to show us something. But I also think whoever follows it will have to face something they are not ready for." Ethan said nothing. He only looked outside, toward the little street veiled in the afternoon's thin fog. The town had grown accustomed to the Bobcat's presence, but still kept their distance. People talked in the cafe, but no one wanted to get too close to the story. Only Ethan, and perhaps Hank, knew that these return visits were forming an invisible path. And on a night when the snow would fall thick, that path would reveal itself more clearly than ever before. Chapter 4. The path no one dared to walk. That night, North Bend seemed to vanish beneath a thick blanket of white. Snow did not fall in gentle flakes, but in great sheets, swept in waves by the wind that howled through every alley. The streets, already silent, now held only the sound of gusts rattling window panes and the groaning hinges of a few abandoned houses. Ethan sat in the shop, the dull yellow light swaying with each powerful gust. The electricity had been flickering since early evening, and the heater whined in protest, straining to hold on to what little warmth it could. He had no intention of going outside. No one in their right mind would set foot in the forest in a snowstorm like this. But then, through the fogged glass, he saw it. The Bobcat stood in the middle of the snow-covered street, its fur bristling against the wind, snow clinging thick to its ears and whiskers. Its golden eyes glowed like shards of amber lit from within. It stared directly at him, unmoving, then turned its head north. Ethan rose, pulling on another coat, wrapping a scarf, and grabbing his leather gloves. When he opened the door, the wind lashed his face, carrying the damp scent of pine and a cold that seemed to pierce through the fabric. The Bobcat still waited. When it saw him step outside, it turned and moved off through the snow, leaving a crisp trail of prints. They crossed Main Street, passing dark, silent houses. The streetlights cast dim halos, barely enough to catch the snow sweeping sideways through the air. Beyond town, the ground changed from hard-packed gravel to nothing but deep snow. The wind grew fiercer, lifting chunks of snow from the ground and cutting visibility down to only a few yards, about 2 to 3 meters. The Bobcat walked ahead, pausing now and then to glance back. its gaze seeming to ask. Still keeping up, Ethan lowered his head and quickened his pace. The trail led to a familiar path from his childhood, one the adults in town had always forbidden children to take, because it burrowed deep into the northern forest, where winter swallowed even sound. After about 15 minutes, somewhere between the roar of the wind and the hiss of snow, Ethan caught another sound, thin, faint, muffled, like a stifled whimper. He stopped, listening, and there it was again. Closer this time, the Bobcat turned onto a narrow side trail where the bare branches arched overhead, forming a roof that cut the wind. At the end of it, a leaning wooden shack appeared, its walls mottled with rot. The door was blocked by a broken board. Ethan shoved hard, and the wood clattered dryly against the frame. Inside was pure darkness, the smell of damp rot mixed with a faint metallic tang. He switched on the small flashlight he carried. The beam landed on a small figure, trembling, a child, hands bound, mouth gagged, sitting against the wall. Its eyes were wide, wet, but still sharp with awareness. Ethan rushed forward, pulling off his gloves and flipping open his folding knife to cut the ropes. When he pulled the cloth from the child's mouth, it sucked in a hard breath, coughing violently. The child was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, hair tangled, cheeks flushed from the cold. Wrapped around its shoulders was a piece of blanket identical to the one from before, only now marked with fresh blood. The noise at the door made Ethan spin. The Bobcat's ears shut up, and it growled low. Through the gap, the shadow of a man filled nearly the whole frame. His breath plumed white in the cold, and in one hand he gripped a length of wood. "Leave the kid," the man rasped, his voice rough against the wind. Ethan stepped in front of the child. "No." The man took a step closer, squinting against the glare of the flashlight. He swung the club, but the Bobcat lunged. Snarling, the blow struck the ground instead, sending snow spraying. The man stumbled back on instinct, dodging its claws. "Run," Ethan shouted. He scooped the child into his arms and kicked out the small rear window of the shack. The cold wind whipped in, but he did not hesitate. He leapt into the deep snow, his legs sinking to the knee. Behind him came the sounds of snarling, shouting, the thud of a struggle. He knew the Bobcat was keeping the man occupied. Snow blurred everything, the way paint runs in water. Ethan's breath burned in his chest. The child was lighter than he expected, but the cold made every muscle in his body strain. Each step was a fight. Somewhere behind them, a cry rang out, then silence. Only the wind remained. At the edge of the forest, the Bobcat appeared suddenly at his side. Its fur was disheveled, and one shoulder was streaked with blood. It ran alongside him, its eyes fixed forward, guiding the way. Main Street emerged, the yellow glow of the first house spilling onto the snow. Ethan nearly collapsed as he reached the doorway of the general store. The door swung open and Hank rushed out, followed by several townspeople. They took the child from him, wrapping it in a blanket and calling for an ambulance. Ethan turned to look for the Bobcat, but in the white haze, there was only its trail of paw prints, stretching to the forest's edge before vanishing. He stood there, breathing hard, the warmth of the child still in his arms. Chapter 5. When the snow stops falling. The next morning, the town awoke under a fresh layer of snow that blanketed rooftops, sidewalks, and the spindly street lamps. The sky had cleared, and the pale winter sunlight shimmered on frozen tiles, scattering into glints like shards of broken glass. There was no longer the howl of the previous night's wind, only a silence so deep that the grinding of a snowplow's wheels could be heard from several streets away. On Main Street, the general store door remained slightly ajar. Hank stood in the doorway, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes were fixed on the northern forest, where white-gray clouds still clung to the treetops like breath that had yet to fade. In the back room, the child lay swaddled in 3 layers of blankets, their face less pale now, but eyes still wide and alert to every movement around them. A paramedic knelt beside them, speaking in a soft, reassuring tone. When the parents arrived, they nearly collapsed, clutching their child as if to make up for every lost hour. Cries of relief broke out, mingling with the hiss of the heater and the muffled voices in the hallway. Ethan stood silently in one corner, gloves still in his hands. Damp and cold, he did not step into that reunion. Watching from a distance was enough for him to feel the warmth spilling into the room, even though his own body still trembled from the previous night's cold. The image of the bobcat running beside him, its golden eyes glancing back now and then, was still vivid, so vivid he could almost hear the crunch of its claws in the snow. When the ambulance took the child and their family away, Ethan stepped onto the store's porch. The snow beneath his boots had been trampled into gray slush mixed with mud. He looked toward the road leading to the forest. The bobcat's tracks were still there, fading as they reached the tree line, then gone entirely. No sound, no shadow. Hank came to stand beside him. "We will sweep the forest today, but if I am right, it is already far from here." His voice was steady, but in his eyes there was a trace of something harder to name, a quiet respect. Ethan only nodded. He felt a strange emptiness, as if he had just seen someone off without the chance to say thank you. All through the storm, the bobcat had risked itself against a man whose face Ethan never clearly saw. And now, with everything finally quiet, it had vanished as though it had never existed. He sat down on the store steps, arms folded, staring into the boundless white of the snow. The warmth of the child still lingered on his arms, mingled with the scent of blood and damp fur from the night before, a combination impossible to forget. He wondered, how did it know? And why did it choose me? By late morning, townsfolk began gathering, exchanging fragments of stories from the storm. Some swore they had seen a wildcat dart through the streets. Others dismissed it all as imagination. The product of collective panic, Ethan said nothing. Some stories did not need arguing. Near noon, the thin winter sunlight slanted across the row of buildings, melting a film of ice on the roofs. Water dripped in steady, measured beads. Ethan rose and made his way to the shop. Every step on the soft snow reminded him of the night before, hurried footsteps, harsh breaths, and the dark silhouette of a wild creature cutting through the blinding white. When he opened the shop door, cold light spilled into the familiar air of motor oil. He sat down in the chair but did not turn on the lights, letting the dimness settle over him. In that dimness, he pictured those golden eyes again, bright but distant, before turning away into the forest. The afternoon passed slowly. The town's noises returned bit by bit. The slide of tires on ice, the scrape of a snow shovel, the cafe door opening and closing. But inside Ethan, there was still the stillness of that morning, a deep quiet where unanswered questions hung like snowflakes that never touched the ground. Chapter 6. Eyes after the storm. In the days after the snowstorm, North Bend gradually returned to its old rhythm. Main Street once again saw small delivery trucks, the morning aroma of coffee drifting from the North Bend diner, and the jingle of the little bell on the door as customers came and went. But for Ethan, nothing felt entirely the same. He still opened the shop each day, still changed oil, fixed brakes, welded exhaust pipes, but in his mind, the night of the storm played on repeat, the bobcat standing in the whiteout, its silent golden gaze, the low snarl before it leapt at the stranger, and its shadow running alongside him on the way back. Hank stopped by a few times, saying that the search through the forest had turned up nothing. If it wants to disappear, he said, no one will find it. Ethan understood. Bobcats were solitary and wary by nature, but he also knew, on that night, it had broken from its wild instinct to come close to a human. One afternoon, while tidying the shop, Ethan heard a faint sound outside the door. He looked up, his heartbeat quickening. At the forest's edge, some distance from the street, a low, powerful shape moved with fluid ease across the patchy snow and mud. The bobcat. It did not come closer. It simply stood there, still, as if the distance between them was a boundary both understood. A light breeze stirred the fur on its shoulders. Its golden eyes met his once again. There was no urgency in them now, as there had been before. Instead, there was something warmer, an acknowledgement, perhaps even a silent thank you. Ethan stepped slowly to the doorway. Standing at the curb, he did not call, did not signal. They simply looked at each other, in a brief moment that seemed to dim every other sound in town. Then, as if by habit, the bobcat turned, slipping into the forest, its shape dissolving into the deep green of bared trees. He remained there for a while, listening to the wind moving through the forest like a long exhale. And in his mind, a truth surfaced clearly. Sometimes Salvation comes from the least expected places, from wild beings we once feared. That night, Ethan sat on the shop steps, watching the snow still clinging to the street. The night sky was clear, the stars like grains of salt scattered across black velvet. He thought of all that had happened, that the child returned to their family, that the bobcat's silence when it had first offered him that blanket. No one in town could fully explain the story, and perhaps there was no need. Some things exist only to remind people that between worlds that seem impossibly far apart, there can be moments when they touch and change each other forever. As night deepened, wind from the forest swept through. The sound was soft, drawn out, like a farewell. Ethan gave a small nod, knowing no one could see. Somewhere, in the layered snow and darkness of the northern woods, those golden eyes still gleamed, silent, but never gone.